Heyo, A-Push students, Chapter 32, The Great Depression and the New Deal, 1933 to 1939. This chapter is going to cover the first two terms in FDR's presidency and the set of legislative initiatives known as the New Deal, aimed at tackling the Great Depression. So there's a lot of information, a lot of important acronyms to know, so let us get started right away. Okay, so a little thing about Franklin Roosevelt's background I want to mention is that he's the only president to ever been elected 4 times, and his policies are going to really transform the role of government in the United States, and it kind of makes the political makeup that we have today when we think of the Democratic Party as the party of more government regulation and things like that. Franklin Roosevelt was the 5th cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, so they are related. And just like Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin grew up in a very privileged household, and his parents had a lot of money. But when he was 39, there's an important event in his life that is going to affect him in that he contracts infantile paralysis, better known as polio, which leaves him paralyzed from the waist down. So not only does this kind of humble him, but it also gives him a sense of resolve to overcome this illness or just to function in society, which is, many say, is the big reason why he developed some qualities like tolerance, compassion, and strength of will. And that really shapes his kind of resolve as a person. It's going to affect his political life as well. Another equally important thing that's going to affect him is his marriage to his wife, Eleanor. She was kind of known as the conscience of the New Deal programs, and she's going to consistently push for more broad reforms and government initiatives. And the reason that first ladies of the United States, meaning wives of the president, engage in activist causes is because Eleanor Roosevelt kind of set that standard. So as you remember, Hoover had been elected in 1928, and the Depression really started to pick up in 1929 and 1930. Roosevelt won the Democratic nomination for president largely on a program that he labeled the New Deal. There was nothing really specific about this program, but it called for massive amounts of government spending to help relieve the suffering of Americans and bring the country out of the Depression. Roosevelt labeled the financial troubles throughout his time as president as the Hoover Depression, and many felt that Herbert Hoover wasn't doing enough to alleviate the suffering brought on by the Depression. Hoover, in contrast, kind of stuck to his guns and said that free enterprise and free initiative were going to eventually lead to the ending of the Depression. As you're going to see in the next 2 slides, Roosevelt wins the election pretty handily. We'll talk about his inaugural address in just a minute, but it's one of those things that is pretty memorable. So there's the 1928 election, Hoover versus Al Smith. Here's the 1932 election, Roosevelt versus Hoover. So you can see almost a complete reversal. All right, so obviously Hoover was an unpopular president, and what Roosevelt was proposing had a lot of broad appeal to the people. So the Inauguration Day speech on March of 1933 is generally well known as probably one of the most famous inaugural addresses in American history, in large part because it was a rough time. It was a really cold winter, and Americans were suffering in huge numbers because of the Depression. Roosevelt says, I'm going to attack this thing. I'm gonna be really honest with you people. I'm going to be really upfront. Times are really tough, but the famous line from this address is, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he's saying, we need to, it's going to, that's the thing that's going to paralyze us into acting. We need to act decisively and boldly to deal with this Depression. So the first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency were unprecedented in that the amount of legislation passed by Congress and the number of programs that were established to try to address the Depression was on this completely new scale. And it's because of FDR that every new president is kind of measured by what they can accomplish in their first 100 days in office. It's kind of an arbitrary number, and I don't really know why historians talk about it in terms of the first 100 days, but there you have it. So we talk about the New Deal. It's kind of useful to break it down into the 3 R's, which stands for relief, recovery, and reform. All the laws and agencies that were established during the New Deal by the federal government were trying to accomplish a lot of things. So for relief, there were Americans that were unemployed or starving, and recovery is going to try to bring the economy back up and get people spending money again, get people working, get the banks open. And reform was basically making sure that something like this couldn't happen again through government regulation and a reform of the banking system. In trying to address the Depression, Roosevelt and the Democratic Party are going to embrace a lot of these progressive ideas that have been talked about for a long time, but the federal government really hadn't tried to tackle them. So think about things like unemployment insurance, minimum wage regulations, a pension system for the elderly, restrictions on child labor. Most of these had never really been tackled by the federal government in a substantial way, but it's the subsequent New Deal legislation and the time that Roosevelt is president that these things are really going to start happening. So here is an example of some of the first 100 days legislation. So these are sweeping programs that are enacted within the first 3 months of Roosevelt's presidency. You're going to have to know a couple of these. There's a lot of acronyms. They call it the alphabet soup of all these different New Deal agencies. And hopefully, in the name, you'll be able to discern what it is they're advocating for. So let's go through a couple. A huge reason why the Depression was so bad is because the banks were closed. And the banks failed because they let out too much money and it wasn't really, subject to a lot of regulation. So people were afraid to deposit their money in the banks. Because people were afraid to deposit their money in the banks didn't have any money to lend out, and therefore the credit system in America was essentially frozen. So one of the things that Roosevelt wanted to do was to try to get people to put their money back in the banks and trust the banking system again. So he tried to do this a number of ways. One way is trying to relate to people through what are called fireside chats. And these are addresses that he made over the radio. And think about the name fireside chat. You sit down by the fire and it's a warm place and you have a close conversation with a friend. And that's kind of what he was trying to do in terms of relating to the American people, trying to keep them in the loop on what was going on, try to build public support for his policies. So to follow up on that, some actual legislation that's going to happen is the Emergency Banking Relief Act and the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Acts. And so these are aimed at trying to regulate the banks. The Glass-Steagall Banking Act created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, which basically guaranteed that if your bank failed, the government would refund or insure your deposits. Originally, this was only up to $5,000. So if you had $10,000, you would only get back $5,000 of that. Nowadays, the FDIC is still around and it will insure deposits up to $250,000. So that's what the federal government wanted to do in terms of backing those banks, giving people the assurance that the federal government would back up the bank in case it failed, which is going to hopefully reassure people to put their money back in, make them feel a little more confident, and then hopefully get the banking system, moving again, which would help move the economy. So in banking commercials today, you hear member FDIC. This is basically where it came from. So look at the effect in this chart showing bank failures. 1933 is the worst year in the Depression, and then after the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, that pretty much goes away, right? So unemployment had gone to insane heights during the Depression. It was about 25% at the start of Roosevelt's term. Anything outside of 10% is pretty bad for the economy. 25% is catastrophic. So there were a number of agencies created that tried to provide both relief in the form of jobs and also economic recovery. So let's discuss one of them specifically. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, was established during this time. It made government camps in the wilderness that employed young men from both the city and the country. They operated kind of like a military facility, which is why they're called a corps, and they worked on government projects like firefighting, flood control, swamp drainage, and road construction. The money that they made would often be sent back to their families. So you have the government providing jobs for people, and it's kind of a new step we haven't seen before, and you're going to see this done through a lot of New Deal agencies. One of the things I want to mention about Roosevelt is that he with the New Deal is all these programs together, but he didn't necessarily have a really clear plan on what to do. He kind of said, we're going to try stuff and we're going to keep trying. If we fail, we'll try something new. But like the idea of just keeping up with trying things and experimenting, you're going to see these agencies kind of overlap and it gets kind of dizzying. But at the same time, he just said, this is something we need to try to do. Two other New Deal agencies I'll talk about right now are the HOLC and the CWA. The Homeowners Loan Corporation refinanced mortgages on non-farm homes and made it easier for people to afford a new house. Housing and construction of new houses does a lot for the economy. So the idea is to reinvigorate the housing market, which would also help the banking system by loaning out more money, which would then help a lot of other industries that go into making houses. And the CWA was basically just a straight up relief agency that provided temporary jobs for the unemployed. So again, here's another slide talking about major New Deal measures. We're going to talk about a couple of these, and you will have to know, about 7 of these, going forward. How did the government afford this? You might be asking. Well, Roosevelt engaged in what is called deficit spending, which is basically borrowing more money or spending more money than you actually have in order to jumpstart the economy. If this sounds controversial, it is. This is the backdrop in which we talk about government spending today. And we have a huge deficit in America today. And we had some deficit in America before this, but as you're seeing, the spending that Roosevelt initiates goes way beyond what previous presidents had been willing to spend. In trying to take a bigger role in addressing the Depression, Franklin Roosevelt was trying to keep people's faith in the democratic system and get them to continue to support and trust the government. Anything he's going to do is going to be controversial. And I know you can already think of maybe conservative critics who felt Franklin Roosevelt was doing way more than the government should be doing. Let's also keep in mind this is the same time that Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany and eventually becomes a dictator, and Mussolini is in charge of Italy, and Joseph Stalin is the leader of the Soviet Union. And there's a link between economic crisis and mistrust of the government that sometimes leads to a rise of dictators. And the worst fears of Roosevelt's critics was that he was using too much federal government power and could eventually become a dictator himself. So that's kind of your standard criticism of Roosevelt overextending his powers as president of the United States. But let's talk about some other critics and what their criticisms were specifically. So the Depression is going to last from 1929 until 1941. In that time, Roosevelt's going to have a number of vocal critics who are going to provide other solutions or push Roosevelt to do more. Father Coughlin, for example, had a very popular radio program. And on the political spectrum, you would probably make him a little farther to the left than Roosevelt, maybe more socialistic in his goals. He wanted Roosevelt to nationalize major industries, heavily regulate the monetary system, and provide more protection for labor rights. And he had about 40 million listeners on his radio program in the 1930s. One of his big slogans was social justice. And I put that in quotation marks because that means a lot of different things. So it's just important to understand what it meant to him. Eventually, Coughlin is going to give a little too much praise to Hitler, and he's going to turn a little more anti-Semitic in his broadcast. It's going to lead to him kind of declining in his influence. Huey Long is also a major challenger of Roosevelt's ideas. He's a fellow Democrat. He was governor of Louisiana and also is a senator for a short while. He proposes probably the most radical program to basically charge 100% tax on anybody who earns more than $1 million. So basically you can earn $1 million, anything over that, the government keeps all of that, redistributes that money to the poor through direct relief. It was known as the Share Our Wealth program. Again, we talk about Roosevelt. He's taking a bigger role in the government, in the role of government than before, but nothing nearly as radical as Huey Long's initiatives, which obviously are going to be popular with certain economic segments of the population, right? So let's talk about another New Deal agency, the Works Progress Administration. Over time, this agency spent $11 billion and provided 9 million jobs over the course of 8 years. And you're going to see this theme repeated that a lot of these projects are infrastructure projects, things that the government kind of should be doing in terms of improving roads and bridges and building highways and things like that. But they're employing a lot more Americans than before. So it's the idea that the government employing people, not necessarily giving them a handout, but just giving them a job that they are getting paid for, which then might help keep the economy afloat. Some of the more controversial jobs that they employ people for, things like writers and playwrights and artists. So an example here is a mural painted by a WPA Works Progress Administration program. So you can see that they're, some might argue this is not a good way to spend government money, but at the same time, it kept people employed. So there's different sides to that issue. Since the 19th Amendment was ratified, women had begun to push for more space in the political and intellectual life of the United States. Eleanor Roosevelt is, as First Lady, and a newspaper column that she writes, she addresses social issues in the United States and continues to propel women into more prominent government positions. One thing she did that was pretty, controversial at the time was she got into an airplane and flew with the Tuskegee Airmen, which was an all-black fighter pilot regiment in Alabama. So the Tuskegee Airmen, she went up in an airplane and flew with them, which was considered kind of controversial at that time. Frances Perkins earns the distinction of being the first female cabinet member when she's appointed Secretary of Labor under the Roosevelt administration. And she had been an advocate for workers' rights since the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, if you remember that. Mary McLeod Bethune was director of the Office of Minority Affairs in the National Youth Administration, making her the highest-ranking African-American in the Roosevelt administration. The National Recovery Administration was one of the most complex and far-reaching of the New Deal projects. Basically, it was designed to help assist industry, labor, and the unemployed. It would work out codes for fair competition under which hours of labor would be reduced. It put a ceiling on the maximum hours of labor someone could work, and it established minimum wages. All these measures were aimed at trying to get businesses to offer more jobs and pay their workers enough to help ease their economic burdens. It also gave labor the formal right to organize into labor unions. So these fair competition codes basically were trying to give workers more rights. And one of the ways that the government tried to compel people to do this was establishing this blue eagle logo that you see. So pressuring companies into cooperation was one of the ways through which the NRA tried to ensure fair labor practices. If it sounds like too much government regulation in the economy, that's what some people thought, so much so that the NRA is going to be struck down by the Supreme Court in 1935 as an unconstitutional agency. The Public Works Administration is a lot like the Works Progress Administration, which basically called for millions of dollars of government spending for industrial projects. These would employ workers and help improve the infrastructure of the United States. Talking about the 21st Amendment, sales of liquor have historically been good for the government because the government collects a lot of taxes off of these sales. So combine that with a need for federal revenue and combine it with the deficits in the liquor industry that, those people being able to produce liquor would help the economy in that way. So all that leads to the 21st Amendment, which repeals the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, and that is ratified in 1933. Prohibition only lasts about 14 years, and it's generally regarded as a failed experiment. This is the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington State. It's just one of many Public Works Administration projects implemented during the New Deal. We know that farmers were suffering before the Great Depression really hit, and now there were a lot of farmers who were being forced off their land because they couldn't pay their mortgages. To try to help with that, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration was established. This is complicated. It's very complicated, so please bring questions if you have them. Basically what it does to try to regulate the price of agricultural products was that it would ask some farmers to grow certain products, and for other farmers who grew the same product, the government would pay them a subsidy to basically not grow that product and just not grow anything. So it sounds weird that the government is paying you not to do something, but think about it in terms of how the price of goods work. So if 100 farmers are all growing wheat, the price of wheat is going to be really low. But if you have only 50 farmers grow wheat and you pay the other 50 ones not to grow anything, the price of wheat is going to go up and help those 50 farmers, and the other ones are going to be able to stay on their land because they're getting a government subsidy. It wasn't meant to be a permanent agency, and it is one of the more controversial New Deal agencies we will see. But as long as you understand that the goal was relief for farmers and economic recovery, then you are in good shape. Similar to the NRA, if this one sounds like too much government regulation in the economy, well, the Supreme Court saw that too, and the AAA is going to be struck down by the Supreme Court in 1936. So remember that dry farming technique near the end of the 1800s in the Great Plains? Well, combine that with a drought in the 1930s, and you have what's called the Dust Bowl, which is basically dust storms that you can see in this picture that would engulf entire regions. These farms were basically, destroyed, and so it's going to lead to tens of thousands of farmers going through this massive migration to areas where there's agricultural work. A lot of that work is going to be in California, and a lot of the farmers are going to be coming from Oklahoma. And so they're going to gain this derisive nickname of Okie, and that is used kind of in a discriminatory sense because they're going to face a lot of discrimination in the workplace when they try to move to California for this kind of work. This is depicted in the John Steinbeck novel, The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939, if you are interested in this time period. It's a really excellent book. So we talked about this when we talked about the Dawes Act, but I want to mention it again, that the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 is kind of sometimes called the Indian New Deal, because basically, just to refresh your memory, it gave the tribal lands back to Native American groups and canceled out the assimilationist policies in the Dawes Act. It also conferred citizenship to Native Americans for the first time in American history. Here's a map showing the Dust Bowl, especially the worst part is going to be in the panhandle of Oklahoma. We've talked about relief, so let's talk a little bit about recovery and reform. The Securities and Exchange Commission was established in 1934, which basically acts as a watchdog agency to investigate fraud, deception, and insider trading in the stock market. This agency is still around today and still investigates issues related to fraud and corruption in the stock market. One of the other industries the federal government exerted more authority over was the public utility companies. There was this battle between public utilities and private utilities. And basically, the Public Utility Holding Company Act empowered the Securities Exchange Commission to break up utilities they thought were monopolies. So we're going to see the government take more control over public utilities rather than letting them stay in the hands of private companies. Another big project during the New Deal that's gained some notoriety is the electrification of the Tennessee Valley through the construction of dams and other projects. It's under the agency, the Tennessee Valley Authority. So it's just a huge construction project. As you can see here, the dams and power plants lead to all that area becoming more electrified. You can see that prior to 1930, still about 65% of homes were lacking electricity. We're going to see that number shrink steadily over the course of the 30s and 40s. In continuing with the reform theme, let's talk about Social Security. So to help combat unemployment and to provide a safety net for the American people, the Social Security Act was passed in 1935, which created a pension system, meaning payments to the unemployed, the old, people who are too sick to work, things like that. This is financed by payroll taxes on employers and employees, and it is still one of the New Deal agencies that is in existence today. Many other industrialized nations in Europe have similar pension systems. So by 1939, there were over 45 million Americans eligible for some form of Social Security benefit. So this is one of the longest lasting legacies of the New Deal, aside from the agencies I've already talked about that are still around today. Among other reforms during the New Deal is going to be the creation of the National Labor Relations Board, which again reinforced labor's right to self-organize and bargain collectively. The Wagner Act is actually known as the Magna Carta of labor for the ability to protect the interests of workers. And then again, you have the Fair Labor Standards Act, which establishes minimum wages and limits hours for certain industries, as well as addressing issues related to child labor. This is a map showing organized labor, membership in organized labor. And you can see that after 1930, there's going to be a significant rise in membership into labor organizations in the United States. In the election of 1936, Republicans didn't really have a lot to run against except, the New Deal legislation and the things that Roosevelt was doing. So the Republican candidate, Al Landon, was a political moderate who did accept some of the New Deal legislation, but he condemned Social Security and the excessive government spending brought on by the New Deal. Roosevelt is going to win the 1936 election by the largest electoral vote margin since the era of good feelings in 1820. So there's a map showing that. Roosevelt's reelection in 1936 was interpreted by the president as a mandate for more reforms and more New Deal legislation. What had been happening over the last 2 years, though, was the Supreme Court was continuing to strike down a number of pieces of New Deal legislation. They saw Roosevelt's actions as socialistic and wanted to curb some of these expansions of government power. Roosevelt felt that his reelection in 1936, combined with congressional elections in 1934, which gave him Democratic control in both houses, showed public support for the New Deal, and the Supreme Court, he felt, was standing in the way of American progress. So 6 of the 9 justices at the time were over 70 years of age, and Roosevelt had not been able to appoint any of the judges in his first term as president. So what Roosevelt does is he develops a plan to try to have this work in his favor. It's going to end up being a pretty major political miscalculation on his part that's going to prove to be very unpopular. So let's talk about it. What he proposes is getting Congress to pass legislation that changed the rules over how many justices there could be in the Supreme Court. Basically, the law he wanted was that if there were any justices over 70 who didn't want to retire, then it would free up another seat and allow the president to appoint a new Supreme Court justice. So because there were 6 justices over 70 who weren't retiring, this would have allowed the president to appoint 6 new justices, increasing the number on the Supreme Court to 15. And obviously, he would appoint justices that were going to be favorable to his New Deal legislation, which would then overrule some of the objections from the current Supreme Court justices. So let's just be clear about this. There's nothing illegal about what he's doing. It's perfectly within the rights of Congress to change the number of Supreme Court justices. But I think you can already see why this might be considered controversial. It's known as the court packing plan because the idea or the perception is that Roosevelt is just trying to pack the court with people who are going to agree with him, rather than try to compromise and work for a common solution. So many saw this as an overextension of presidential power and something that eroded the system of checks and balances. So it ultimately is unsuccessful. He doesn't get enough support from fellow Democrats to do this. And it's largely seen as, if the conservatives are talking about Roosevelt becoming a dictator, that's one of the ways that a dictator operates, right, is by manipulating the court system to rule in his favor. So in evaluating the New Deal and the legacy of the New Deal, it's just important to understand this was a really transformative time in American history. There were some temporary measures like the NRA and the CCC meant to provide jobs and recovery. And then there are more permanent things that really radically transformed people's relationships with the government, like the Social Security Act and reinforcing labor rights. So those measures are going to face a lot of criticism from Republicans who feel like the federal government is doing too much. And if that sounds familiar, if that sounds like the way we talk about the role of government today, where Republicans are more conservative, Democrats more liberal, that's pretty much when this new dynamic formed. Okay, and so I want to make sure you all understand that the dialogue we have today about the role of government on the federal level was kind of forged in America during the New Deal. And there's going to be other things that get added into it, but this is the big thing when I talk about government spending, right? And we kind of stereotype Democrats with wanting to spend more money, Republicans with wanting to spend less, okay? So supporters of the New Deal basically felt that this was a legitimate role for government and that it was necessary in order to help the American people. But you have detractors, right? So how you feel about this kind of, whether you think it's effective or not, does kind of say something about your own political beliefs or maybe your ideas about the role of government, whether you really want that to or not. So anyway, more discussions we'll have, more talks about this. Here's the timeline. Thank you for listening.